Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Will Storr. He is an author and journalist. Last time we talked about his book, The Status Game, and today we're talking about his latest book, A Story is a Deal: How to Use the Science of Storytelling to Lead, Motivate, and Persuade. So, Will, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Ricardo. It's great to be back again. Thank you.
So, what is the premise of your book?
Well, I wanted to write a book about the power that story has to persuade people, to influence people, because it seemed to me when I was doing my just general research for other books that story has this extraordinary ability to beguile people, to completely take over their brains and really define their identity. So that's what I wanted to write about this time.
And what is storytelling? I mean, what are you referring to when you talk about storytelling?
Well, that's a big question. So, how do you define story? So, my working definition of story for this book is it's a unit of information that describes the overcoming of an obstacle in pursuit of a goal, which sounds sort of quite dry, but that's basically what a story is. It's a little bit of information about obstacles and goals, and it works. Its evolutionary purpose is to connect lots of individual human brains together and get them all thinking as one about the obstacles and goals of the world outside them. So that sort of hints at its power, really. We're one of 5 existing species of great ape. We're not like an ape, we are an ape, but obviously we're very different from the other apes. And that difference is essentially that we're part ape, part ant. So the other apes, even though they live in troops, they overcome their obstacles and pursue their goals as individuals, pretty much. Whereas humans don't. We do it in the form of these super organisms. So like an ant's nest, we get together and and cooperate, and it's the cooperative group that overcomes the obstacles in pursuits of the goals, not the individual. That's how that describes all of human life, from a cult to a religion to an economy to a society to a football team to a corporation. You name it. That's how we do it, and that's kind of how we've taken over the world. And so, how do you get these apes, these individualistic apes, to work together to cooperate? That we do it with story. That unit of information that describes an obstacle and a goal takes over your brain, and you all start thinking as one, and that's how we do it.
So let's talk a little bit about the evolutionary psychology of storytelling. So first of all, what are the origins of storytelling in human societies? I mean, do we know how old storytelling is?
Well, not exactly. The nearest date I could come across was somewhere between 30 and 100,000 years ago. So somewhere in that bracket, we started using, orienting our kind of lives around story. And the way I tell it in A Story is a Deal is that there are really three great phases of evolution of life on Earth. The first phase is the single-celled bacteria. So if you were to trace your family tree and go back 3.8 billion years, you'd find at the root of your family tree this single-cell bacteria. And for hundreds of millions of years, that was the only life on Earth. And so single-cell bacteria overcome obstacles in pursuit of survival reflexively. So it's a reflexive technology. So it's quite straitjacketed. It's not dynamic. Basically, if the conditions outside my single-celled body, in inverted commas, are X, I do Y. So, it can do a lot with that. But the problem with that reflexive technology is that it's not very good for dealing with unpredictable environments. And of course, what is life, but not if not unpredictable. So then the second great phase was the emotion system, the feeling system, out of which comes emotions. And feelings are amazing because they don't instruct their owner what to do; they advise. So if you imagine you're a cat and you're a hungry cat in an alleyway, and someone's dropped half a Big Mac by the bin, and you feel the feeling of hunger, and so that compels you to want to go and get the burger. But then on a roof up there is a cat staring at you, and that brings another feeling, which is fear. And now you've got these two feelings, and you can make a decision based on the unpredictable environment about what to do. So, an incredible invention, like really amazing thing. And for more hundreds and hundreds of millions of years, it becomes the dominant technology on Earth for overcoming obstacles in pursuit of goals. And of course, because we come from single cell bacteria, we come from, you know, these intermediate animals, we still have all this technology within us. So the immune system is reflexive like a bacteria. The digestive system is reflexive like a bacteria. We don't have any conscious control over these things. They just happen. Of course, we have a huge feeling system, emotion system. We're incredibly emotionally complex creatures. But then, as I say, between 30 and 100,000 years ago, this new thing came, which is even better than the feeling system. That's the story system. And story allows us to share information about obstacles and goals, swap information about obstacles and goals, store it in culture in the form of oral storytelling, and then subsequently writing. And of course, as I said before, it allows us, most importantly, to cooperate, to all cooperate, collude on obstacles and goals, and work together in the form of these ant-like superorganisms. So that, in a nutshell, is the history of life on Earth.
Yeah. And what are the functions of storytelling? Does it serve specific social functions, for example?
Yeah. So I guess it's all nested beneath that. The main goal, which is to get us, you know, working as individual members of these highly cooperative superorganisms. And but so that's the kind of the grand level. But nested beneath that is this, you know, how does storytelling affect us as individuals? So, you know, so partly most obviously we have these storytelling brains, and by that I mean that we have the human brain remixes reality and turns it into a story. So, you know, we are, as Chris Frith, the neuroscientist, memorably said, that the invisible actor at the center of the world. And you know, unlike other animals, we have all these things going on. We have the plots of our lives. We've got these meaningful journeys that we're going on. We want to get stuff, and we imbue our journeys with great meaning. You know, like great religious meaning, or these sort of grand meanings. We have this special effect of morality. So, you know, gossip was one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest form of storytelling. And gossip, you know, gives us this sense of heroes and villains and allies and teachers. You know, that's this great storytelling kind of layer that goes across the things that we're doing with our lives. So there are all kinds of ways in which, you know, we have autobiographical memory for the past. We imagine the future in a way that no other animal does. You know, we could envision great quests, great paradises, great heavens. You know, no other animal has a concept of heaven, and you know, earthly heaven, which could be the goal of some political party, or a spiritual heaven, which is the goal of the great religions. So we have these storytelling brains. So of course that has, you know, profound and immense consequences for our individual lives.
And why are we so attracted to storytelling? I mean, is there any sort of psychological explanation for that?
Yeah. So, as I say, you know, storytelling is the thing that allows us to work cooperatively. So that's what nature wants to do. That's what evolution wants us to do. It wants us to be a successful cooperative animal. So it's always compelling us to be a good member of a cooperative group. So what does that mean? Well, it means two things. It means that we have very powerful instincts within us that want to connect with other people. You know, we know humans are universally driven to seek connection with like-minded others, not just anyone, with people like us, with people who are a good cooperative fit for us, who we can work together with. So we're in this kind of restless connect and detect mode, I call it, where detect and connect. So we're detecting, are you like me? And that's why we dress the way that we do. We have accents. We have this dense cloud of social information that broadcasts information about who we are to other people, and that broadcast is for drawing us towards people who might good cooperative partners, and repelling those who might not. So of course that's the course of a lot of amazing stuff in our lives. That's also course of a lot of division and problems in human society. So that's connection. So and if you think about some of the most profoundly important moments in your life, a lot of them are going to be about connection. They're going to be moments of love and joy of friendship, joy of family, community, all of that stuff. And likewise, if you think about some of the worst moments in your life, it's the opposite of that. So universally, humans dread social disconnection, rejection, ostracization, any kind of feeling that we're being rejected socially is deeply, we'll be hurt. We will obsess over that thing and try and fix it in our minds, try and repair it. So that's the first thing. we want to connect into cooperative relationships, whether that be a dyad or a group. The second thing is status. So once we're in a cooperative relationship, we want to be useful to it. We want to be a good cooperative partner. So we want to develop the reputation of somebody who is valuable, and that's the status system. So status is simply the information from the people around us that we are of value in some way, that we're competent, that we are generous, selfless, virtuous in some way. So we also seek that. So again, if you think about some of your most pleasurable moments in life, some of your most exciting moments in life, they're going to be connected with status. When your podcast achieved X, or when you got this dream guest on, or whatever it might be, when you got your PhD, I don't know what it is. And same as connection, some of the worst moments in life are connected with humiliation, which is the sudden and public removal of your status. I mean, status and humiliation has been called the nuclear bomb of the emotions, and it's connected with some of the worst features of the human animal. So connection and status are basically what heroes in stories achieve. If you think about a hero at the end of an archetypal story, everybody loves them and considers them important and amazing, and that's what we want in the story of our lives. We want those heroes' awards of connection and status, and we want them more than anything else. We want those things more than often we choose that kind of stuff more over continuing to live our actual lives. That's how mad we are for connection and status.
Yes, we'll come back to the topics of connection and status later in our conversation. What kinds of stories do people usually like to tell?
People, well, that it depends on what they're trying to get out of the story. I guess people who are telling stories are trying to achieve ultimately, those two things, connection and status. That's kind of what we're always trying. We're trying to achieve three things: survival, connection, and status. Those are the three things that motivate humans. But so often storytellers will want to achieve a sense of connection. So you might get a politician or a business leader that tells stories in such a way that they want people to feel connected with their group and identified with their group, so they're loyal to it and passionate about it and start to devote their time and attention and behavior towards that group. And then, of course, the other thing is status. Storytellers want to achieve the status of being a great storyteller, but also successful leaders kind of give status with their storytelling. They kind of say, I'm going to tell you a story. If you join my group, if you join my mission, if you buy my product, your reward will be status. If you buy this particular iPhone, if you buy this set of training shoes, if you vote for my political party, we're going to make America great again. You're going to be, a think different, creative genius like Apple promised you. You're going to be Michael Jordan like Nike promised you. So connection and status are the kind of two things that storytellers are subconsciously offering.
So I would like to ask you now about the concept that you talk about in your book. What is active belief?
Yeah, active belief is this kind of concept that I wrote about first in the status game, and I think is really important. So fundamentally, the brain, what it wants more than anything is to achieve connection and status. So it's always asking this question: who do I have to be in this time and place in order to achieve connection and status? And those questions are especially important when we're growing up. That's what kind of childhood is. We're figuring out our environment, we're figuring out our culture, we're figuring out who we have to turn ourselves into. And when we're doing that with, parents are telling us that, teachers are telling us that, experience is telling us that. So that's what human brains are. That's the question that human brains are always asking. And so that's kind of why we're so vulnerable to story, because story contains those answers. And the brain isn't particularly interested in the truth of reality. There's no reason to be. What it wants is to figure out who I have to be in order to earn connection and status. So if you think about it in terms of, sorry, that's my this is my dog. Hello, James. You're on a podcast. If you think about that in terms of religion, which is the easiest one to explain, someone, you've got to go away now. Somebody wants to be a Christian, and so in order to achieve, because that's a status game, and we want to achieve connection, we want to achieve status. So Christianity is a great status game to play because that's offering those things. So how do we achieve those things? Well, to be connected into the game of Christianity is pretty easy. You've got to believe, and you've got to. The main thing you've got to believe is that Jesus was real and that he died and he was dead for 3 days and he rose again. And if you believe that, you're a Christian. You're basically going to be accepted into the wider Christian family, because that's what you have to believe in order to be a Christian. Okay. But that's not really enough. So that's fine. You're a Christian, but now you're a Christian at the bottom of the Christian status game. Now you want to be a good Christian. You want to be able to go to your church every Sunday and have people look you in the eye and go, there's a great Christian. So that's where active belief comes in. It's not good enough for human beings just to believe something. You have to allow that belief to take you over. You have to allow that belief to define your identity. You have to become that Christian. So that means, living by the 10 Commandments, eating fish on Fridays, going to church on Sundays, going to confession, and so on and so on and so forth. And of course, every denomination of Christianity has slightly different rules and ways of being, which defines the Christian hero. So that's active belief, and that kind of works kind of across all groups. If you go to work for a corporation, they will have a model of perfect kind of ideal heroism that they want everyone to be, and the greater you adhere to that model of ideal kind of heroism in that corporation, the higher you'll theoretically climb up the status game of the company, the more money you'll get, the more the more the rewards you get, and all of that stuff.
Yeah. What is the process of identification, and what role does it play in storytelling?
Well, identification is really critical to storytelling, and that's whether you're writing a novel or whether you're leading a company or a political party. And before I was talking about that kind of detect and connect mode we're always in. So we're always subconsciously looking for potential cooperative partners, people like us to hang around with. And it's a natural thing. And it's, as I said, it's the cause of lots of terrible things that we obsess about in the West, but it's also an ineradicable part of human nature. You're not going to get rid of that kind of people like us thing. And so that's kind of what identification is. If we're reading a novel or watching a film, and the person on that screen is somebody that we identify with, then we're going to be into that story because that's somebody that we care about. It's someone like us, and so to a part of our brain, it kind of becomes us, and we start following that character's ups and downs and trials almost as if they're happening to us. And the more we identify with that character, the more we care about that character, the more we get kind of into it. And that's also important for persuasion. So if a political party is trying to get voters, if a corporation is trying to get customers, they have to tell a story with which their potential voters and customers identify, and if they identify with their story, then they're going to be in, and that's kind of a magical thing for the leader, because once the people are in, they're in. Your stories become part of their identity, which means they're going to defend your group like they're defending themselves, because in a sense they're defending themselves. They've taken on board they've folded your identity into their identity.
And what kinds of psychological effects does identification have? In the book, you go through several different examples, like changes in personality, the way we perceive beauty, our political beliefs, our moral behavior. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so if you remember that the point of this is that we become good cooperative partners. So it's not a passive process. Once we join a group that we identify with, that group starts to change us. We become more like that group, and so everybody's in that group becomes more similar to each other. So that's the persuasion, and it's changing us quite profoundly. And there's lots of different work that shows different ways this happens. One test looked at furries. People who dress up as furries. Everyone knows furries. So when they test the person, give furries Big Five personality test, they find that when they've got their first soda on, when they're all kind of suited up in their crazy animal costumes, their personalities all change in sync. They become more extrovert, they become less neurotic, they become more open. So their personalities, their Big Five personalities, all change, and they all change in the same direction. That's one. Probably my favorite example of this is about architects and about how identification changes our perception of beauty. So you'll have noticed that new buildings don't look like old buildings, like new buildings across the world. They all look the same. They don't have a sense of place. They don't have lots of architectural detail. They're flat, they're square. They have no pitched roofs. They're flat roofs. They're shiny. They all look the same. And so you might think, well, that's because people are obsessed with money, and these are cheaper buildings to build than the posh buildings we used to get in the old era. But that's not true. Those buildings that people don't really like get built because architects think they're beautiful. So architects have this unique taste in which they love the aesthetics of modernism, and they've loved the aesthetics of modernism for getting on for 100 years now. They call it modernism, but it's actually very old-fashioned look. And so there was a really fascinating study that looked at how architectural students' aesthetic preferences change, and it tracked the changing of their preferences as they went through architectural courses at university. So at the very beginning of the course, they tested their aesthetic preferences generally by showing them pictures of beautiful people and ugly people. And they found that when they compared the architects to the general public, they were the same. They found the same people pretty and sexy, and they found the same people ugly and unattractive. Fine. And they tested their aesthetic preferences with buildings, and they weren't as similar, but they were pretty similar. They were almost the same. But then every year they checked them as they went through university. Those architectural preferences, they changed, and they all changed in the same direction. They all started to like flatness, shininess, no roofs, lack of ornamentation and detail, all the things that exist in the buildings around you. And what's amazing to that is it's like you can't argue that what happens is that these students are being taught this aesthetic genius because they're not, like, if they were all having different esoteric tastes and preferring different things, that would be true, but they're not. They become more and more conformist, and they all end up liking these same shiny, flat, square buildings. And that's the main reason we have such ugly, hideous. That's when you go to a city, everybody wants to go to the old town. Nobody ever wants to go to the new town. They all want to go to the old town because we have this curse of this architectural status game, which says that flat, shiny, square is beautiful, and people who like classical and old and buildings that are appropriate to their place are low status and plebs, even though that survey after survey after survey all around the world shows that by a long way the general public prefer the old style buildings. So that's a really powerful example of how identification changes aesthetic preference. I mean, there's a huge amounts of work, which I'm sure you're aware of, which looks at our political beliefs, and even though people find this idea repugnant, what's found over and over and over again is what defines our political beliefs is not our own freely perceived decisions about how the world works and how the world ought to work. What principally defines our political beliefs are what our political group believes, and so one study managed to persuade Republicans in America to endorse lavish welfare schemes if they were persuaded to believe that that's what their party wanted, and likewise they managed to persuade Democrats to slash welfare once they were persuaded that that's what the Democrats wanted to do. So as as I say, people hate that idea. They really fight against it because that's not the story that we want to tell about ourselves. But identification is massively important, and of course it's one of those things you can see very much clearly in other people. You don't like to think about yourself that way, but you can see it in other people. You can see it in your daughter, who becomes a Swiftie and suddenly becomes obsessed with Taylor Swift, talks about nothing but Taylor Swift, starts dressing like Taylor Swift, holding a body like Taylor Swift. Like they become like a mini Taylor Swift because they've identified so powerfully with her. And so it's that process. It's a bit like the demonic possession from a horror movie. Is what happens to us all the time, and the more possessed we become by our identity group, the more that active belief kicks in, and the more our entire being, our entire self starts to mimic, the values and roles and the ideal model of hero that group broadcasts.
Do we know how storytelling develops in infants? I mean, when they start appreciating storytelling, and I mean, perhaps some of the steps they take in terms of how they become appreciative of it?
Well, yeah. So we do know quite a bit about that. I mean, for me, one of the most important things is this idea of gossip, because I think we start to really become storytelling animals when we start to gossip, and gossip is thought to be perhaps the earliest form of storytelling, evolutionarily speaking, because it's gossip that allows us to work in these highly cooperative, super organisms. So it was only when we could start to gossip, and because gossip is really information about, is this person being a good member of the super organism or not? And if they are, we raise them, and if they're not, we punish them. And that's how we police in the group and get in the group to work. And so we know that children start to gossip almost as soon as they can talk, So as soon as they can string a sentence together, they're telling these little tittle-tattle stories about what my brother did and what my sister did, what somebody did at kindergarten, and someone pulled my hair. You know, it's completely innate, and we do it straight away. So from that perspective, it kicks in really early. And of course, from before we can talk, our parents are telling us stories, morally inflected stories. And my book is called A Story is a Deal, and that's what I mean. It's like a successful story is always subconsciously making that deal with your identity. If you behave in the way that the story is modeling, you're going to get connection, you're going to get status. So children's stories are very clear. Here's a hero, here's Goldilocks, here's Jack and his beanstalk, and look what happened when they were naughty. They lost their connection, they lost their status. Look what happened, they were good. Well, they won connection, they won status. And we tell those stories over and over and over and over again to our children, and our children become fascinated by them. They want to hear them over and over and over and over again. And the deep subconscious reason for that is because it's information about how do I get connection, how do I get status, and it really burst into adult life in early adolescence. So it's in early adolescence that we leave the family home and join our peer groups. And it's in early adolescence that a specific part of our brain changes that makes us very sensitive to social judgment from other people. So that's when we start becoming, we forget about the family life, and it's that our peer groups, which have much more influence over us. So we the active belief starts to be about the peer group that we're hanging out with as a 12, 13-year-old at our new big school.
So earlier we talked about identification. Tell us now about the phenomena of identity growth and identity anxiety, and how do they connect to storytelling?
Yeah, so I said before that connection and status are these things that humans overwhelmingly want, and time again humans choose status over their own actual lives. Whenever a terrorist fires blows up a suicide vest, or somebody goes to war, we're choosing our identity over life. So we are completely obsessed with our connection and our status, and our brains are constantly monitoring how we're doing. Does this person like me? Do they not? Does this person value me? Do they not? And if we get the not, we start to get really we start to get really panicky. We start to get really full of anxiety. We even become physically ill. I mean, that it's been, we've been told time and time again over the last 20 years how bad social disconnection is for us. Loneliness is for us. Has become well known now, but less well known is also it's the same for status. The less status we perceive that we have, the more likely we are to get ill. There was one study that gave a bunch of people, they exposed them to rhinovirus, and the people at the top of the status hierarchy were less likely to then get a respiratory infection as a result of the exposure than the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. So there's lots of evidence that low status is bad for us physically. So that's what I call identity growth. Identity growth is we're living a great life is when our identities grow, and by that I mean, we're getting ideally more connection than ever, but at least it's stable. We're not losing connection, becoming lonelier and lonelier, and we want to be getting more status as we get older. Ideally, gradually. I think sudden rises in status are very bad for us, usually. So that gradual rise in status. So that's identity growth. But also that we get identity anxiety, where when we sense that our stores of connection and status are at risk and imperiled, we get deeply anxious. And I think that sense of identity anxiety is such a huge part of life in a 21st century market economy. It's quite hard, in a hunter-gatherer group of 25 to 50 people. That's who we'd be living side by side by every day. It's relatively straightforward. You've got to be a half-decent person. You'll get your connection. You'll get your status. But we live in these vast groups now. We've got social media now. We've got these models of heroism. They're literally models. They're the most. We see on our TV screens and our computer screens incredible superhuman feats. So we're measuring ourselves against these extraordinary people. Connection is harder and harder to sustain in these big groups. So I think identity anxiety is a very serious thing, and we know that it correlates with suicide. When people feel chronically lacking in connection and status, and importantly, when they feel that lack is irreversible, when they think they're stuck and there's no good happy ending to their story, then they're very likely to become suicidal, and again choosing identity over their actual lives.
Right. Talking about connection, what kinds of psychological effects does the feeling of being connected have on people?
Psychological effects. Well, I mean, all the good ones. I mean, we feel joy, we feel happiness, we feel like our lives have meaning and purpose. That the feelings of being securely connected are profoundly important to the human animal, because that's one of the great things that the human brain wants us to achieve, because it's directly connected to our survival. As our brains were evolving, the more securely connected we were, the greater the chance that we were going to survive and have children that survived. And it's the same with status. Like that's just as important, because the more in hunter-gatherer groups, the more they've got relatively flat hierarchies compared to our hierarchies today. But still, in hunter-gatherer groups, the more the status that you have in that group, the more food you got, the better food you got, the safer your sleeping sites, the greater your access to choice of mates, which is of course something that people really want. The better the conditions of life for your children. So connection and status are both directly connected to our survival and reproduction, which is why they're so important to humans, and that's why we have such amazing feelings when we experience those things.
How do political figures take advantage of the power of identification and connection in their speeches?
Well, the main thing, as I say, is that human brains don't really care about truth. What they care about is, what do I have to believe in order to get connection and status within this group that I identify with? So that's a massive shortcut for leaders. They don't really have to tell you the truth. Like Brexit, to give a controversial example, it didn't matter. Like it didn't matter that I suspect a lot of the Brexiteers knew full well that it was economically going to be an absolute disaster for Great Britain, but they appealed to the story, and so they achieved identification by saying, we share your concerns. And there were famous adverts about endless queues of migrants queuing to get into Britain. We share your concerns. We're like you. So they're identified. And then they tell them a story. We're going to take back control. And that story is a story that promises status. And the most powerful political stories are always stories that promise status. So if you think about, Hope, the Obama story, one of our most successful politicians, Tony Blair, New Labour, New Britain, is an optimistic, hopeful, promising status. Make America Great Again. Hitler's Third Reich, the communists and their paradise of equality that they were going to achieve, in which nobody would suffer and everybody would be living in kind of this heavenly harmony. These are all promises of this kind of better tomorrow. So those are the stories that work, and still lots of our politicians struggle to kind of get their head around this. Kamala Harris struggled to tell a story of hope. It was all about horrible Trumpies and horrible, men and all this stuff. It doesn't work. And we have a similar problem in the UK. Keir Starmer, our current Labour government, they're getting a bit better at it, but they spent their first 3 or 4 months just telling this endlessly gloomy story about what an awful mess Britain was in because of the last government. People didn't give a shit. It might be true. It doesn't matter. The truth doesn't matter. It was, and so they became incredibly unpopular, that government. They're turning it around a bit now, but they became incredibly unpopular, despite having won quite convincingly, because the storytelling was so bloody awful. It was just doom and gloom and misery, and nobody wants to hear that from their leaders.
Do you think that the effects of connection are more salient in collectivist societies than individualist societies, or is there no effect there?
Yeah, I don't know any data that's looked specifically at that, but I certainly suspect that is true. But sometimes it's hard to separate, those things, because if you think about if you're in East Asia, a collectivist society, and you're a loyal communist, you're still playing a status game, because you want to be seen as a good, loyal member of the Chinese Communist Party. So yeah, I'm not sure the differences will be as pronounced as you might imagine. Like nobody is immune from the status game, as was discovered in the Soviet Union, which became, which at one point sociologists found 12 distinct social classes in the Soviet Union. Or they didn't get rid of the status game as they promised. They just inverted it. So the people who were at the top ran out the bottom, and the people who were at the bottom ran out the top. And that's always what happens with these utopians. Is they promise they're going to get rid of the status game, and they can't, because it's in our brains. It's how we experience the world. They just want a new hierarchy with themselves at the top and their enemies at the bottom. Is what that was the woke thing as well. They're just trying to invert the hierarchy. They're not trying to get rid of it.
Does what you explore in the book connect in any way with Robert Cialdini's principle of persuasion of unity, or people being motivated by shared identities?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think so. Yeah. So that it certainly sounds very similar. We are, that's what identification is really. We see somebody with whom we somewhat share an identity, and we join that group. But it goes deeper than that, because it's not, as I say, it's not just that we share the identity. Once we connect into a group, we become more like that person. We become more like that group. It changes us in quite profound ways. And like I say, that's true whether you're joining a religion or whether you're getting married. I mean, like in 20 plus years of marriage to my wife, I've become more like my wife in lots of ways I can tell, but also probably in a million ways I can't tell. And she's become more like me. And that's because we're a successful cooperative partnership, and that's the kind of power of this. It's what they call shared reality. It's not just that you join a group of like-minded people. It's just you let that group take you over and you become more similar to those people. So I think it's a even more kind of powerful concept than the idea of shared identity.
Why do we like underdog stories so much?
So underdog stories are universally popular all around the world. If you go through, the folk stories of, Africa, East Asia, South America, Russia, underdog stories are always told. We identify with underdogs, and I think there's a couple of big reasons for that. So the first reason is that the underdog is the closest that we can probably get to a universal description of the human condition. I said before about a story being an account of obstacles and goals. I mean, that's what we're doing as humans. We are identifying goals and we're overcoming obstacles in pursuit of them. So that's what we're constantly doing. We're constantly looking for goals and fighting obstacles. So that makes us automatically an underdog. I mean, that's one of the definitions of an underdog, is that the problems of life seem immense and almost insurmountable. So we feel like underdogs, and then certainly at our times of greatest distress in our lives, we feel like underdogs, and that even goes for some of the highest status people in the world at the moment. Like I expect Elon Musk at the moment, as weird as it might seem, feels like an underdog, and then you might go, that's crazy because he's the richest man in the world, but also he's one of the most hated men in the world right now. So that's a pretty terrifying place to be. I expect there's part of Putin that feels like an underdog because he's got the entire kind of West ranged against him. So unless you're suffering from pathological narcissism, you pretty much feel like an underdog. So I think that's one of the big reasons why underdogs are so universally, we identify with them so easily. Is because when we see somebody who's desperately trying to get something, but there's massive obstacles in their way, part of our brain goes, "Oh, that's me. I'm like that. Yeah, I get it." So that's one of the things. The other thing is to do with status and how status games are played in human groups. So the kinds of status that we really care about are the ones attached to prestige or reputation. So we want to be seen as a competent person and a kind person, essentially. So success and virtue are other kind of big things. And the thing about prestige is we can't claim it in human status games, in human groups. It has to be earned. It has to be given to us by other people. And that makes sense when you think about its purpose, which is to get us to be cooperative members of a group. So status is a reward. You can't fucking go around demanding it. So when people go around demanding status from other people, it gets our backs up, partly because that's not how we play status games in human groups. We offer it to you. You don't claim it, and the other thing is that status is relative. So if somebody swaggers into the room, the big dick, and makes it clear that they consider themselves the highest status person in the room, assuming you think they don't deserve it. I mean, this might be like Tom Cruise coming into a group of like amateur actors, and in which case it might be acceptable. But like, it's assuming you think they don't deserve it, it's going to really piss you off how they're acting. And again, universally, in hunter-gatherer groups, there's lots of policing that goes on. with, you know, big shot behavior, they call it, this idea that someone's swaggering in, being the big I am. So that's the other thing, the underdog. It's the opposite of the overdog. Like, you don't want to be an overdog, because if you're an overdog, people are going to hate you, and they're going to not just hate you, but they're going to plot towards your downfall. So it's a very bad strategy for success in human groups.
What is it that in your book you call storybeing? What is that?
Well, storybeing is, you know, I think one of the things that I wanted to do with A Story's a Deal is that there's a zillion books about persuasive stories, but they all do that thing of talking about storytelling. So how can I tell you a story which is going to persuade you to do something, which of course makes a lot of sense. But I think it's actually missing the much greater piece of the puzzle, which is the fact that it's not just that we read stories and watch stories on TV and on a stage. It's that our lives are a story. We experience our daily life as a story. When we go to work every day, it's a story, you know, and it might be a boring story to everybody else on earth, but it's the only story that really matters to us, or the main story that really matters to us. So if you really want to know how to persuade other people, you've got to understand storytelling, not just the things that we tell, but it's something that we do. Yeah. So that's when I talk about story being. It's like, if you're a leader that wants to persuade your team, if you're a politician that wants to persuade your electorate, you have to show up in their lives as the right kind of narrative character, as a hero or a light figure or whatever it is that you want to do. So that's what I mean by story being.
What constitutes persuasive storytelling? I mean, what are the characteristics associated with it?
Well, three things really, main things. One is, the first is identification. So you've got to tell a story that people identify with. And then once they've identified with it, you've got to offer them connection and status. You know, so if you do those three things, you know, you're an incredibly powerful person. You know, you're a leader, you're a guru, you're a priest, you're a prophet, you know, whatever it is that you want to be.
Yeah. So tell us about because this is something you also go through in your book. Tell us about an example of a successful marketing campaign and another example of an unsuccessful campaign.
Yeah. Okay. So, what's an example of a successful marketing campaign? One campaign which I'd never heard of but if you've got Canadian listeners and viewers, they will have probably heard of this. Was a campaign in the year 2000 for Molson beer. So at the time, Molson was suffering. It was the #1 beer brand in Canada, but it was suffering because people started getting into drinking wine, and they were starting to getting into drinking, microbreweries. It was that hipster phase of microbreweries was all in. So Molson was suffering. So they got in a new ad agency to try and rescue them from the doldrums. And so the head of this ad agency was a Canadian guy, and he was acutely aware of how irritating that Canadians found it when Americans and everybody else actually mistook them as American. Like, Canadians don't like that. You know, they just don't like that. It annoys them. So he decided to sort of build an advert around this whole concept. And so this, what happens in this ad is that it's a very ordinary looking guy in a plaid shirt and jeans goes on a stage, and he starts talking about all the things that Canadians are that aren't American, essentially. So it's Z, not Z. You know, we don't say about, we say about, in all the misconceptions, all the mistakes, all the things that differentiate from them being American. And he gets more and more passionate as he goes along, and it just ends up with a big shot of a Molson beer. So if you look at that dispassionately, it's mental. It doesn't make any sense, because there's nothing in the advertising campaign about the beer. It doesn't tell you about how much it costs, what it tastes like, its calorie content, its fucking foamy head, or whatever it is that you might want to, you know, you use to sell beer. There's nothing information. All it is basically a description of an identity. You know, so it's offering connection, it's offering that identification. So people are going, yeah, that's like me. But it's also offering status. It's saying, look, you know, we're better than those Americans. You know, we are great as Canadians. We do, you know, we are, you know, we police by consent and all these other things that they mentioned. So it was offering connection. It was offering status. They pulled this genius move. It debuted in the year 2000 during the Academy Awards, the broadcast of the Oscars. And it was directly after South Park performed their song Blame Canada. So all the Canadians have watched South Park do Blame Canada. Ad break, and he got you know, I Am Canadian, which is what the ad was called, I Am Canadian, and it was instantly successful. You know, it became completely viral in kind of pre-social media Canada. on Canada Day, groups of kids would amass and recite the rant. I forget how many millions, but within a matter of weeks, millions have been added onto the share price of the Molson beer brand. It was just enormously successful. So that's a really good example of a company that's using identity to sell a product in a way that doesn't make sense if you don't understand storytelling. Because like so many successful ads, it isn't about the actual product. It's really about identity. So that's a successful one. And I guess a really easy, a couple of easy recent examples, relatively examples of unsuccessful ones are ads that do the opposite. So I'm thinking specifically about the Gillette ad. Is this the best man? I can't remember what it was, but it was the one where basically they were painting men as toxic males who were just interested in bullying, and they painted men as, especially white men. It was white men in particular, significantly as sex pests, bullies, just nasty pieces of work, and was basically saying, you can do better, men. So what's that doing? It's taking status away. And what was their reward? Well, they got absolutely hammered. And then even more recently, there was, of course, the Bud Light thing where Dylan Mulvaney, who is kind of symbolically somebody that just oozes wokeness and trying to sell a product which is mostly drunk by straight white men. So it's like getting Jordan Peterson to advertise tampons. It's like it's just not going to fucking work. So again, it's taking status away. It's basically removing connection from Bud Light. It's basically if you drink Bud Light, you're a wokey now. It's a total disaster. And it was and both the Gillette ad and the Bud Light ad were psychologically incompetent, and they were punished financially, especially the Bud Light. I don't think Bud Light have recovered from their Dylan Mulvaney ad campaign.
Yeah. So how can people write persuasive stories? What steps can they follow?
Well, the first thing you need to do is to figure out who you're trying to connect with. You can't tell a story. Well, you can. You can try to tell a story that appeals to a kind of mass audience, but the more mass you get, the blander the ad gets, and you're going to have to rely on basic things like humor. Get them laughing along. But if you want to tell a really persuasive story, you need to really figure out who your audience is. What's the story world that they're living, in the middle of? What language do they use? It's really important to figure out how do they define status. What to them does a hero look like? Because every status game has a different definition of a hero. The status game of the Buddhist monk and the status game of the Wall Street banker have completely different ways of talking, being, speaking, living. You've got to understand their story world and just reflect it back to them. And so once you've done that hard work of figuring that out, as the I Am Canadian ad shows, it's sometimes simply a case of reflecting that back to them. And even like a much more famous example is Apple's Think Different campaign, which again has no information about any Apple product in it. It's just a series of black and white pictures of people who've changed the world: Gandhi, Mother Teresa, John Lennon. Think Different. It's basically saying, creative world changers. If you see yourself as a creative world changer, buy an Apple computer, because that's going to give you the identity of a creative world changer. So sometimes it can be enough to just reflect, just in a very specific and accurate way, reflect back that identity to the audience. And then once they see that, they're going to identify with you, and they're going to be drawn to want to buy your product, because part of what we're doing is trying to broadcast who we are, and so your product becomes part of our cloud of social information. So the Apple laptop computer, we hope, is going to broadcast to the women across the coffee shop that we are a creative world changer. That's how that works. And then, of course, and then as well as that, you can offer status. Like a Nike ad that has Michael Jordan in it. You could say, look, if you use our product, you're going to become people like us, but an elevated version of that. You're going to become this dream version of who you've always wanted to be. And those are the persuasive stories that have huge impact. But you have to achieve the identification first. You have to connect with people's identities, and then once you've done that, do the other stuff.
I have one last question. Then you begin your book by talking about Theranos, the company. What are the ways by which the power of storytelling can be used to deceive and exploit people?
Well, I think the Theranos example is just a really good way of kind of demonstrating what story being is. So, I think everybody probably knows the story of Elizabeth Holmes. She said that she'd invented this device called the Edison, and the Edison was amazing. It was just this great device that was like so. At the moment, to do a full range of blood tests on somebody, you got to take out like 2 big vials of blood, and the Edison could do all that with 1 finger prick. So amazing, fantastic. It's going to save lives. It's going to be brilliant. You just go into your Walmart, do a finger prick blood test, and it's going to figure you out completely. Yeah. So she goes out and she wants to get a board of directors. She wants to get investors, and she does it. She tells us she dresses up as Steve Jobs. She wears the black polo neck. She lowers her voice and starts speaking like in a very masculine way, and telling a story. And people start saying this is the female Steve Jobs. That was her story, that she is this amazing genius tech founder. And back then, and it's no different now, people are desperate for that story. They want to hear that story, like the story where they tell of tech is it's full of tech bros. Where are the female founders? Where are the women who've started an incredible company, created incredible products to change the world? Where are they? Well, here she is. So that became an intoxicating story, and that's a story that offers status. And so all of her board of directors were men, I think is important. All men in late middle age, including Henry Kissinger, including the former director of the Centers of Disease Control, people who really ought to have known better. Investors included the founders of the the Walmart family. They included Rupert Murdoch. So Theranos was the Murdoch family's, or Rupert Murdoch's, biggest investment he ever made outside his family of companies. And the really important thing to know about all of these people is that they didn't do any due diligence. So due diligence is a completely ordinary thing to do when you're investing in. Of course it is. Like, someone's coming to your office making all these claims, and you've got to figure out, is it true? And so some people did do that. So Google Ventures were interested in investing in Theranos. And so they sent some dude out to Walmart to get a Theranos blood test. And to his astonishment, they took out 2 massive vials of blood from his arm. So he was like, this is something's weird, something's wrong here. So they didn't invest. So some people didn't fall for the story, but people like Rupert Murdoch and Henry Kissinger and the former director of the Centers of Disease Control, they did without doing any due diligence. And I think they did it because her story offered status. They wanted a piece of her heroism. She was a hero. She was on magazine cover after magazine cover. She was profiled in the New Yorker. She was on TED Talk stages, Forbes magazine stages. She was the female Steve Jobs, and they wanted a piece of it. And so that's why, but in my estimation, why they were so desperate to get involved with her is because of the story, her story being, it was a story that she was representing. And at the peak of her powers, her machine was worth nothing. It had no value because it didn't exist. But her story, her company, was worth $9 billion. And I think that story is, is important because of the lack of due diligence. But it's also important because of the incredible success of the people who fell for it. Rupert Murdoch, Henry Kissinger, these are incredibly smart, incredibly wily, incredibly successful people. And she did a number on every single one of them. And that's the power of storytelling.
So, but in more general terms, how can it be used to deceive and exploit other people? I mean, what are the ingredients and the ways that we can use storytelling to do that?
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about this idea that people consciously use storytelling to exploit and manipulate people. I think most people there are the Elizabeth Holmeses of the world for sure, but I think most people who are kind of leading groups that tell stories which we know aren't true, they're not doing it in a kind of Machiavellian kind of way. They also genuinely believe their stories. I mean, I spent the first part of my career as a journalist, when I was a journalist, doing lots of work with cults and people who believe crazy things like UFOs and ghosts and Holocaust deniers. And so people talk about those people as if they're evil, they're exploiters. That like the TV mystic who's telling your future and contacting your parents. And I found a few of those people, but the vast majority of the people that I ever met sincerely believed the bullshit that they were spouting. So without knowing it, they were offering connection. Like that's what the spiritual is doing. They're offering connection. That's what religious people are doing. I mean, this kind of work has changed my view on religion. I used to be very, very anti-religion. I've always been an atheist, but now I understand. I see that the value of religion is that it offers connection and status to billions of people around the world. Yeah. And we need those things in our lives. And, and it especially offers them to people who are living in much worse socioeconomic conditions than we are in the West. So more power to it, in a way. But I mean, to sort of directly answer your question, at the risk of repeating myself, those are the things that we want. We want to join a group of like-minded people. And once we're in that group of like-minded people, we want to feel that they value us and they respect us and they esteem us. And if we have those things, we experience lives of meaning and purpose and, and general satisfaction, as long as things are going well. Of course, when things start to go wrong, the pain comes.
Great. So the book is, again, A Story is a Deal, How to Use the Science of Storytelling to Lead, Motivate, and Persuade. I'm leaving a link to it in the description below and also to our first interview. So, Will, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so I have a Substack. It's called You Are a Story, and it's weekly essays about this kind of thing, but also about, the kind of pitfalls and pleasures of having this kind of storytelling brain. So that's at willstorr.substack.com.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks, Ricardo. It was a great pleasure to be on. Thanks for your great questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.